Hello everyone, in this video we'll be talking about data linking in Excel. So ordinarily when we're typing information in an input cell, we can hard code it like is the example here where we've just got a number written in here, or we can link it to another number within the cell, within the worksheet. For example, we may have 39.99 written over here, and we can just link to that cell in particular, and then we just have equals F3. Now in terms of data linking, there's two main variants as to where we can be linking data. So the first option is linking from another workbook. For example, we may have an input sheet in a completely new workbook. Up here we've got book 1. So let's just quickly see what happens if we were to link in the pack sale cost from another workbook into, say, Coca-Cola. So now, as you can see in the formula, it'll show this as the name of the book that it's coming from, and the name of the tab that it's coming from, and then the cell reference that it's coming from. The second tier is if we're linking to another tab, but in the same workbook. So let's have a look. Let's link it into this tab over here, $29.99. So now you'll see it won't have the file name before it because it's assumed that that file name corresponds to whatever workbook we have open currently. And then we have the cell reference. And then the final option is just linking into a particular cell, as we mentioned before, and it'll just have the cell reference. So those are the main tiers of linking. So let's talk about linking into another data workbook first of all. Now, you may be working in a company in which a lot of your workbooks have a lot of cell references within the workbook like this, where it is actually linking into another workbook. Now you can tell straight away whether your Excel workbook has those intra-workbook links by selecting a particular cell and seeing it in the formula, or perhaps you don't want to go through each individual formula to figure out whether there is a link in there. What you can do is instead go to the data ribbon of the Excel workbook you want to check, and then go to the edit links. Now if this is grayed out, so if there's nothing in there at all, for example up here, what you'll see is that actually means, because it's grayed out, there's no links to another workbook. So you could have a link to another tab in that workbook, and the edit links button will still be grayed out. So let's just bring that back so we can see the edit links. So if we press up here on edit links, you'll see this box up here which will tell you all of the particular links within the workbook. Now for every instance you'll have a separate line, and what it'll tell you here is where the source is that we're pulling the data from. So we know that it's coming from a workbook called book 1, and what type it is, and the status of where it is. Now the first problem with having intra-workbook links is if we don't have the book 1 open. So let me just quickly save this to my desktop so we can reopen it later. So I've now closed out of book 1 and I've saved it to my desktop. So what you'll see now is when I select on where that intra-workbook cell reference is, it's now, instead of linking just to the name of the workbook, it's linking to the entire location of the workbook, and you'll notice that it's coming from my desktop right now. Now the other thing to notice is that if someone else were to open up that file, or that file were to be deleted, so let's say, okay, so I've now gone and renamed the Excel workbook from book 1 to book, and now I've just refreshed that Excel reference over here, because Excel can no longer find the reference that it's coming from, and it's actually prompted this to open up and find the location of the file. Now what can happen when someone else opens up the file is that they'll see what is a ref error, because they won't actually have access to the file. And what that means is the actual cell reference itself will be lost. So even if you do happen to relocate that file at a later date, it'll say something like equals cell ref, or you might have a sum hashtag ref. So you won't actually know what the formula is, and it can actually flow on throughout your entire workbook and have a lot of negative impacts in your workbook. So this is our first lesson, is wherever possible, avoid intra-workbook linking. If you have to link to data which is outside your workbook, I recommend what you do is hard code the entire sheet, copy it into your workbook that you need it. At the top, say where the source of the data is coming from, say source, workbook, location, xxxx, put the location in there, and then just hard code the data, and then you can sum into that tab. But first, let's go back to understanding intra-workbook links and how we can actually fix this situation up here. So you'll note that I've renamed book 1 to book on my desktop, and when I press enter, we get the issue. So what we can actually do is, instead of going through that process of refreshing it, we can go to edit links up here, and we can go to change source, or we can go to open source, but because I've renamed it, it's not going to open anything, it's going to get an error. But if we go change source, this is now going to prompt us to find it, and if I find that exact file, it's now going to update the link and see it says status OK. Alright, so that's all good. The other thing is that we can do is we can actually update the values, because by default the values aren't going to refresh. So if you want to go into the other book and update this value over here in cell 3, so I'll do that quickly. So I've opened up the other workbook and changed this to $59.99. Now this will flow through automatically. If it hasn't, what you can do is just go edit links, update values, and even if the source isn't open, it's going to refresh that. Note that it automatically did refresh it because I had both workbooks open at the same time. Now the next thing that I want to show you is this break link, and I use this all the time for the same reason I mentioned you shouldn't be using intra-workbook links. What this does is, for every connection that you have linking to another workbook, if you press that, it'll hard code it. Now the positive is it'll reduce your risk of any hashtag ref errors, which can really screw up your workbook if someone else opens it up, or someone renames a workbook, or it goes missing, etc. The downside is that you lose your formulas. Anything with a connection, so just those cells in particular that have a connection, not the entire workbook, end up being hard coded. So you'll see what I mean if I try this out here, and it gives you this warning. It permanently converts formulas and external references to the existing value. Because it cannot be undone, you may want to save a backup version of the file. So possibly you may want to save a backup of the file before you do this step. So just press break link. So let's see what's happened. And you'll notice that the edit links is now grayed out, which is a good sign. It means that we have no external links currently in this workbook. So as you can see here, this is now $59.99 instead of linking into that particular cell. So that's breaking the link. So let me just bring this back up again. So I'm going to link into that $59.99, and I'm going to rename this to inputs 2. Now the next thing that we can do is to break this link is and incorporate best practice into our Excel file, is to actually copy this sheet into this existing file, and then instead of linking to another workbook, what we're going to do is just link to that same tab within the workbook. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a copy of that. So I'm going to, instead of merging it, I'm going to create a copy. So I'm going to go copy, create a copy, move it to the scenarios workbook, and move it to the end, and press OK. So now we have the inputs 2 tab showing up. So that's the cell that I was linking to, but you'll note that in the original workbook it's still there. Okay, so let's go back to our calculation. So as you can see, even though we've copied that sheet across as a copy, it's still linking to the original work paper, which is in the book work paper inputs to cell C3. So now the next thing that I want to do is actually want to update that cell reference so that it's linking into this tab, which is identical, instead of to this workbook, to that cell. And the way there's 2 ways we could possibly do this, okay? So the first way is we can actually just go in and actually manually update the formula. Because the tab name is exactly the same and the cell reference is exactly the same, what we can do is we can just delete out the parentheses, get rid of the workbook name. So this is now telling Excel to go to this workbook, that tab, inputs 2, and that cell reference. So let's press enter, and you'll see that this is now updated. So let's press Control left open parentheses and it'll take us through to the last tab. So that's a good way of updating it. So the other way to do it, and it might be a bit harder if you have a workbook with lots of links in it, all linking to the same workbook, is we can, let's just Control Z this, so the formula is back. We can use the edit links function to actually change the source. So if I go change and then choose the current workbook, which is the scenarios completed workbook, we can edit links, change source, find the new workbook, which is called scenarios completed. Here it is here. And now you'll see that the link has disappeared because we're no longer linking to another workbook. And if we check this, it's done the same thing. So it's updated the cell reference to the input tab C3, but it's just gotten rid of the workbook name. And now that's going to be a much faster way if you've got thousands of these references throughout your workbook. So it's a good way of doing that. Now the final way of updating that link to something within your workbook is actually using Control F and replace. Okay, so the thing we want to get rid of is this parentheses and then the title name. So what we could do is just select it in the formula, copy, and then do Control F, replace, and then we can go replace all, find what, replace it with nothing, and then go replace all. And there's only one example in here, but if there was multiple examples it would change it for all of them. So now it's just going to link through to that tab, and let's do a Control left open parentheses to follow that through and check it. Yep, okay, that's working. Okay, beautiful. Now the last alternative that I want to talk about is the first one that I mentioned, which is actually just taking a hard copy of the source document, pasting it in to your workbook as a source sheet, maybe call it something like this, source, maybe highlight that it's source, or put a subdivider in like so, like that, so people know that which ones are the source tabs, and you can say this is from book 1 or something like that. And then we can actually just hard code all the values, so copy that, paste that in, values and formatting, so paste that in there, and then we can just link in to those particular cells, or we could do a sum if from this cell, look up a Coca-Cola, and then just update the criteria to be that, and there we have it. It's linking into our source tab. And as I mentioned before, just be clear about where the source is actually coming from. Source hard coded from this location, XXXX, and so forth. So that's good practice. So those are all the different options for actually linking in data, and actually how to link between them, why you shouldn't use intro workbook links, how we can actually fix that using the edit links function and breaking links, including the upsides and downsides to breaking links. We talked about the options in bringing data across, including hard coding it in source and making sure you're referencing to where it's coming from. We talked about updating those links in the cell location, and just one final quick tip. I know I've been using it throughout, but I just want to reinforce the ability to use the equals control plus left parentheses, which is a means of actually following a link through to its source. For example, if we follow this through, we press control left open bracket, it's going to take us to that tab that it's pulling from, and to even the column or cell reference that we're referencing it to. So just another good way of using links to navigate your workbook. So that's everything that we need to know about data linking in Excel.